Sarah is going to kick off today's session.
That's great. Thanks very much, Claire, and good morning, everybody. It's so good to see you. Thank you very much for coming back. We hope you enjoyed Thursday evening, and we're going to be covering a lot more content today, but also there'll be a lot more time for discussion today and for getting to know your Assembly members a bit more too. So just to let you know some changes to the team. So today our wellbeing support is provided by Rob. I think, Rob, you've already said good morning, but if you wouldn't mind giving a quick wave. So just to remind you, if anybody wants to access the wellbeing support, please direct message Rob through the chat facility. So he'll come up as Rob Wellbeing Support. And remember as well, Francis is on hand for any IT support that's required. So just to let you know, we're not going to keep you working all day without a break. We're not quite that mean. So we've got a mid-morning break, which I can't remember the exact time of that, but I think it's around about 11:15. And then we also have lunch. So lunch is at 12:45 to 1:45. We will ensure that you have your full 1 hour for lunch, no matter what's happening with timings. But we do hope to keep the time much better today. So just to cover what we're going to be doing. So we're looking this morning at emissions. So emissions at both a UK perspective and also a Herefordshire perspective. And then we're covering why climate change is so difficult to tackle. So we've got 3 speakers for you on those topics. But before we do that, we're going to revisit the conversation guidelines, which you all worked hard to produce the other night. Thank you very much for that. They're great. And also we're going to hear a short video which just kind of prepares us for the mode we need to be in when we're listening to evidence. So that's it for today. After the presentations, as you might expect, we'll go into a Q&A. That Q&A is going to work slightly differently than it did the other day, so it's going to be through plenary. So the first thing we're going to do is just kick you off with some discussion in your small groups. Max, are we ready to move into small groups? Yes, brilliant, thank you. So we're just going to give you a chance to say hello to one another and just to share any thoughts that you had from Thursday with your group facilitators. So see you back here in about 15 minutes.
Can somebody give me a thumbs up when everyone's back in? Mind you, we'll start to see them. I'll start to see them come back anyway.
Yeah,
I've got you on gallery, so I'll see everybody come back in.
At 10:17, they'll all pop back in regardless.
And you're looking for about 52 participants, Claire. If you go down to
I'll count them quickly as they come back.
No, there's the number down on the screen.
Oh, I can't. Where's that?
Yeah. If you hover over participants, it tells you.
Oh, well, there you go.
I wasn't being sarky.
Okay, welcome everybody, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that brief sort of time with your facilitators just to reconnect. So we're now going to share with you a video by Alan Rennick called How to Approach Evidence. You're going to be hearing lots of different evidence from lots of different people again today and over the course of the weekend. This video was first produced for the Scottish Climate Assembly, but it's subsequently been used by lots of different climate assemblies. So Max, if we can ready to roll, share that with you.
Hello, my name's Alan Rennick. I'm from University College London. I've worked with citizens' assemblies all around the country, and I've been asked to say just a few words about how we approach listening to evidence. You're going to be hearing a lot of evidence over the course of the assembly, and it's useful just to think about how to go about doing that. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. Firstly, I'll say a little bit about the types of evidence that you'll be hearing. Then secondly, I'll talk about how to think about what the speakers are saying. And then thirdly, I'll talk about how to think about how we ourselves listen to those speakers. So firstly, on types of evidence, I think you'll be hearing two broad kinds of evidence over the coming weekends. You'll hear evidence from each other, and you'll also hear evidence from witnesses. So the evidence from each other is just fantastic. You'll have great conversations with people you've never had conversations with before about all sorts of things, and you'll learn so much about people from very different walks of life, very different kinds of experience. And I know from the work that I've done with citizens' assemblies just how valuable that is to participants. So that's really great. Of course, it's important to remember that you're not experts. You're not speaking with experts when you're speaking with members of the assembly. You're here as members of the public. That's why you're so important. But that's really, really valuable evidence. And then second, you'll be hearing from witnesses, people who come in and address the assembly. And there'll be various different kinds of witnesses. There'll be, for example, scientists who've done research on the issues and come up with detailed findings. There will be advocates who argue for particular points of view and particular positions, particular policies. And there will be stakeholders, people who have a stake in the issues, whose lives will be affected by the policy decisions that you're talking about. So it's important to think about those different kinds of witnesses that you'll be hearing, and just to reflect on what can you expect from them? What kinds of evidence will they be giving? What might you need to be careful of when listening to those different kinds of speaker as well? Moving on then to my second topic, thinking about what speakers are saying. So I'm going to give you Alan's 4 top tips for the things that I think you should be asking yourself when listening to speakers. First, most simply, what are the speakers' key points? What are they trying to say? So sometimes that's really clear. Other times you need to do a bit of work yourself in order to work it out. Second, are they backing up their claims with good evidence and arguments? So all of the speakers will be making claims about what's happening in the world or about what the effects of different policies would be. And it's really important to consider, are they actually backing that up with evidence? Are they really convincing you? Are they giving you the material that you need in order to come to a considered judgment? Third, why might someone take a different view? So think while you're listening to the speakers about, well, what might the counter arguments be? What might the other perspectives be on this? And just consider that and think about what questions you might want to put to the speakers during the Q&A. And then finally, thinking across the various different speakers, often they'll disagree with each other. And then it's really good to think, well, why are they disagreeing? Are they disagreeing because they're thinking about the problem in slightly different ways, or they're looking at different kinds of evidence, or they're interpreting the evidence in different ways? Just understanding those differences among the speakers and why they differ from each other is really useful for you in helping to work out what you conclude on the basis of the various different things that you hear. And then the third thing that I want to talk about is thinking about how we ourselves listen. So I guess the ideal in a citizens' assembly is that we're giving everyone a fair hearing. We're listening to everyone equally. But we know that we're all human beings, and it's just really difficult for human beings to do that. We all tend, in fact, to listen to different people in different ways and listen more effectively to some people than to others. And that's because we have what we often refer to as biases in how we listen. So it's just really important to be aware of those different biases that we have. And I'll highlight just a few. So one is we're better at listening to people who present well. So if someone who's presenting is really engaging and they're funny, then it's really easy to listen to them, really easy to kind of get involved. But actually, it could be that the speakers who are a bit more tentative, a bit less flashy, they might have important things to say as well. So it's important to try to get beyond the presentation to hear what they're saying. We're better at listening to people who we think are like us. So there's lots of evidence that, for example, men are a bit better at listening to men, women are a bit better at listening to women. We tend to be best at listening to people who are the same kind of age as us or have similar accents to us. You know, all these kinds of things make a difference to how we listen. And again, if we're trying to focus in on what people are actually saying, then it's good to try to get beyond those initial impressions. We're better at hearing things that fit with what we already think. So this is really, really important. So I'm guilty of this, you're guilty of this, we're all guilty of this. We all tend to find that it's really easy if we agree with something to say, yeah, that's what I think, that's good. Whereas if something doesn't fit with what we already think, then we're inclined to go, oh no, that can't be right. I don't agree with that. Again, that's not giving everyone a fair hearing. That's not keeping an open mind. And in a citizens' assembly, we really do want to have an open mind and do want to be kind of led by all the evidence that we're listening to. So again, it's good to try to move beyond that if we can. Individual stories move us more than evidence about lots of nameless people. So individual stories about particular people, you know, we can relate to them, we can sympathize, it makes sense to us, we can feel it, and it's easy to remember. Whereas the evidence about the general patterns across the population, that can be a bit harder to get into, it can be drier. But again, that evidence, the general evidence, can be really important. I'm not saying the individual stories are not important, but just trying to get the balance right between those different kinds of evidence is really good. We're worried about being liked. So this is a bit different from the others. This is more about when we're having conversations in the group about the evidence that we've heard. And it can be easy to hear people in the group saying things, various different people, if they agree with each other, you might think, oh, maybe I should just go along with that as well, because I want to fit in. I don't want to feel like I'm sticking out. But actually, you know, Citizens Assembly is all about bringing together people with really different perspectives, different views, different life experiences. And it's absolutely fine if you have a slightly different view or a very different view from other people in the group. So it's really important not to be shy and to be willing to say what you think. That's what you're here for, to say what you think on these issues. And then finally, we're better at remembering the arguments that we heard last. So I want you to do a little experiment on yourself at the end of the session, the end of this afternoon. Just think back to this presentation. So he was talking about those various different biases. Which of them can I actually remember? And I bet for a lot of you, the one that you'll remember first is that you remember the argument that you heard last. Just because you heard it last, it's easy to remember. So do just remember, if you hear a range of different speakers talking, it's very tempting just to focus on the last one, because that's the one that's easiest to remember. But try to go back to the earlier speakers as well and reflect on what they said too. They're equally important. Okay, that's all from me. Over to you now. So thank you for listening, and I wish you all the very best for the work of the Citizens Assembly.
Okay, so we thought that was a really, really nice way of leading into revisiting the conversation guidelines that you started to put together at the end of Thursday night's session. So we've reviewed all of those and we've collated them. So there were some really good themes that came out and a lot of kind of commonality around all the different conversations that you had across your 5 groups. So what we've done is we've brought those all in together. I'm just going to share those conversation guidelines with you now, just so that you can be reminded of them, see what they look like as a complete set of guidelines. So Max, if you can just share those with the group now, and I will run through those with us. And these are going to form a really, really important part of the foundation, really, of all the conversations that we're going to have over the rest of this weekend and next weekend. Okay, so the first one, which was about actively listening to other people. So really, really tuning into what people are saying. There was another one around not interrupting people or talking over people. The theme around patience came up a lot. You know, let's be patient with other people in terms of getting them to articulate their views and feelings. Respecting other people's views, exactly what Alan Rennick has just said. You know, you're going to be hearing from lots of different people with different perspectives from your own. Think about the language that we use, you know, making sure that we use language that everybody will understand. And part of that is about avoiding the use of jargon or acronyms. Encouraging healthy debate. You know, we want to hear different views, different perspectives. You don't have to agree with them. So agreeing to differ, that's exactly what, you know, we need to all sign up to. And just making sure that everybody has the chance to speak. Just go on. Okay. Part of that is about just being inclusive, making sure that everybody feels valued, not going off topic. So we've got very limited time, so keeping to topics really important during the course of the discussions that we have. Trying to make clear and concise points, not always easy, but if you can do that, again, we'll maximise the time we've got in discussions. try and create a space where people can feel they can be honest and be open about their views. And we're going to introduce a few process-driven things, really. So lots of you said, actually, we think it would be better to start using the raised hand icon if you want to speak. That will help us to not interrupt each other when we're speaking. And if you're not speaking, to try and get into the habit of staying on mute. So there are conversation guidelines. What we're really interested to know is whether you feel that they reflect the conversations that you had with your facilitators about those on Thursday night. So in order to do that, again, we're going to go back to the ticks and crosses. So if you can go back to your reactions button, and if you feel that you're happy with those guidelines, you can sign up to them, give us a big tick. If not, then give us a cross. And as long as we've got a majority of people that feel that they're happy with those, then we'll adopt those and we'll start using them. I think that's the way that we can, you know, bring up kind of keep on track of the conversations we're having, make sure everybody feels that they can engage. Anybody that's not happy with them, maybe you can pick those issues up with your facilitators in the breakout rooms, but as long as we've got the majority of people saying they're happy, I think we go with those. So we've got, yeah, let's see. So is everybody, most people broadly, yeah, 34 of us happy, one not so happy. Maybe with that person that's not so happy can discuss that with their facilitator when we move into the breakout rooms later on. Okay, so we're going to move on now. We're going to start to introduce the speakers. And so I'm going to hand over to Sarah to do that.
Thanks very much, Claire. Yeah, so as Claire said, we've now got 3 speakers, all excellent speakers. The first 2 are going to be looking at emissions. So just following on from what we learned about climate change on Thursday evening, this is looking specifically at emissions and where they come from. So we're going to introduce each speaker in turn. And then the third speaker is Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, who's going to be talking to us about why climate change is difficult to tackle. So we're going to hear recorded presentations, just to remind you, but then speakers join us live for a Q&A. So just before we go into those presentations, just to remind yourselves of what you heard through the Alan Bennett video, and just to listen with an open mind and capture down key points and note any questions that you have for those speakers as you go along. Okay, Max, are we ready for the first video? So our first speaker is Tim Yer from Midlands Energy Hub, and he's looking at...
Good morning.
Sorry.
That's okay, Max, don't worry. He's looking at emissions from a UK perspective. Thanks, Max.
My name's Tim Yer. I'm the Regional Senior Energy Projects Officer for the Midlands Energy Hub. My role is to support the local authorities in the Marches region, which include Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin and Herefordshire, to deliver on their net zero ambitions. Just going to share with you a quick presentation. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction and recap on climate change. I know you probably went over this a little bit on Thursday, but it's never doesn't harm to do that again. A bit about the global picture, a little bit about the outputs from COP26, which was the environmental conference that was held in November in Glasgow, and a little bit about then the UK's carbon footprint and the policies that are in place around that. So the planet's average surface temperature has risen by around about 1.2 degrees Celsius during the last century. Globally, the 10 hottest years on record have all been since 2005, and 2020 was the hottest, joined to 2016. And it's likely that 2021 would be around about the 5th or 6th hottest. We'll just have to wait until the final records come in for that. In the UK, the 10 hottest years have all been since 2002. The scientific consensus is that this change has been driven largely by increased carbon dioxide and other human-made emissions being emitted into the atmosphere. This graph is just showing the CO2 from burning of fossil fuels, but it does, and just to give you context, that's not a huge amount of emissions compared to the rest of the atmosphere. being around about, well, pre-industrial, we're up to 280 parts per million. Now we're up to around about 420 parts per million. But it does show that there's still a big increase in the amount being emitted. So it's up from around about 6 billion tonnes in 1950 to around about 34 billion tonnes every year from now. We do see a bit of a downtick at the end of that, which is probably entirely down to the global pandemic. So who's responsible for these emissions? Well, it depends a little bit about how you look at the stats surrounding this. But to give you an idea, the UK now emits around about 450 million tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. That is only just 1% of the global emissions. But even at that 1% of those territorial emissions, that we're still amongst the top emitting countries in the world. That was 15th on that in that table. If we consider, though, that we've been emitting carbon dioxide for a lot longer than many other countries, and we consider our emissions over time, we're probably the 5th largest emitter of all time. But this perhaps isn't the full picture either, because a lot of the goods and services we now buy come from other countries who have got even higher levels of carbon dioxide emissions, such as China. So what about China? And it's always one of the things that's raised as to why are we bothering when China aren't. I would say that China, while they're not doing as much as we'd like them to, they are doing something. They do now have a net zero target. It's not as ambitious as the UK's. Ours is 2050, theirs is 2060. But they are looking to peak their emissions by the end of the 2020s. However, as everybody will have heard, they do have quite a large number of coal-powered power stations. So it'll be interesting to see how they tie those two things together. The other reason that UK really needs to have a role in this is that we are a leading country. We are one of the wealthiest and most influential countries in the world still. We are part of the G7, the G20, the UN Security Council, and a founding member of NATO. So we have a leadership role to play in tackling global problems. And this is one of the largest global problems that we have to deal with. It's not a new problem, though. We've known about environmental issues for many years now. In fact, if we went back 50 years this year, the first UN conference on the environment was held in Stockholm. And since then, we've had a number of important staging posts, which I'd like to quickly touch on now. The first being the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, where we signed a non-binding treaty to reduce emissions to 1990 levels. Since then, every 2 years, we've had one of these COP meetings, which is a Conference of the Parties, which is a UN meeting to sort of talk about these topics. One of the most important was in 1997, where the first legally binding agreement to cut emissions by 5.2% by 2012 was agreed. We actually managed to hit that target, but it didn't include some of the larger emitters, so perhaps we didn't get the same sort of impact as we would have liked it to have. We then have to roll on nearly 20 years to Paris in 2016 to find the next big important agreement. And that was signed to keep the temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. And importantly, was also to look at making sure to see if we could get to 1.5 degrees above that level. In Glasgow this last year, in November, December, we actually came up with a pact to affirm that agreement and try to work out how we keep that 1.5 degrees within reach. What happens in the future is really down to how seriously we take the challenge. If we don't do anything about it, we could be heading towards really catastrophically high levels of warming, up to perhaps even 5 degrees C. We need to be acting now quickly and fast and hard to actually bend that curve around to make sure that we keep it down to 1.5. So how are we going to do that? Well, we came out of Glasgow with the Glasgow Climate Pact. That was where we managed to secure near global net zero targets. So a lot of countries actually signing up to net zero now. They're also been enhancing their own individual countries' contributions. They're called nationally determined contributions. And 153 countries put forward much more enhanced versions of their NDCs, which will help strengthen the potential of getting to net zero. Importantly, we came up with some other projects, other pledges to help countries to do that. So coal power being an important one. 190 countries have agreed now to phase down coal. We've also had 91% of the world's forests covered by a pledge from 137 different countries to end deforestation by 2030, which is a positive step forward. We've also had an agreement to accelerate the transition to EV for both vans and cars. So that will make up quite a significant chunk of any savings. And importantly, we had a pledge from over 100 countries to reduce the amount of global emissions of methane, and that's the first time we've had anything surrounding methane within one of these agreements. Also had some positive work around adaptation. It's important that we actually help those people who are already suffering from the impacts of climate change, such as rising sea levels or much more severe weather. Going along with that is the need for finance. We still haven't quite hit the $100 billion a year goal, which was set back in Paris. We're likely to hit that around about 2023 now, but that is a little bit too late, and we've still got a lot more work to do to get that done. And we still now need to work with others and improve the collaboration between countries to help us achieve those goals. So how are we doing? Well, the climate action tracker sort of helps show how we're going to get there, perhaps. So at the moment, we know where we are, we know what that 1.5 degree goal is, but if we look at the different levels of agreements that we've got in place, if we look at just the current policies and actions that are going on, we're heading towards 2.7 degrees unless we do things about that. If we just consider the targets, the countries' nationally determined contributions that they've already agreed to, that cuts down to around about 2.4 degree rise in temperature. With the other pledges that the countries have signed up to, if we fulfill all of those, we can get that down to around about 2.1 degrees Celsius rise. Only in the most optimistic of scenarios there can we get down to that 1.5 degrees. And so we're really holding on to it by our fingertips, really. So as far as the UK is concerned, we're doing fairly well against our territorial emissions, those are the emissions that we emit from the UK within our boundaries. So we've had about a 50% decline since 1992. So we're doing reasonably well, but that doesn't include emissions from things like aviation or shipping, or even the supply chain of manufactured goods and services which are imported into the UK. So we've still got some way to go. And a large proportion of that is actually due to one sector alone. So the top line there, the orange line, that is the emissions from our power sector, from electricity. And you can see there's been a significant decline, certainly within the last 10 years. And that is what makes up a huge proportion of the UK's reduction so far. We're not doing as well in any of the other sectors, really. So transport and buildings are particular areas which are high emitters, and we need to do something about it. And that's something that I think we'll be tackling in other sessions. It's not the whole picture, as I mentioned earlier. We've also got those goods and services that are brought into the UK. Emissions surrounding those have only gone down about 14%. So we need to think of ways that we can tackle our consumption. And that really comes down to behaviour change. And again, I think that's something you're going to be discussing in much more detail later on. In terms of what's happening in the UK, we've had a raft of different policies come up in the last year, particularly in the run-up to COP. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's just to demonstrate there is a huge amount of work going on in the background to sort of change the policies within the UK to help us meet our net zero ambitions. But we're not necessarily doing as well against those as we might like. There are only a few areas which are fully on track at the moment, and we need to work with governments at all different levels, at national government, but also at local level, to see where we can put pressure on to make some of these other policies actually meet the ambition that we need to see. And only if we do that can we play our full part in meeting that 1.5 degree warming target. So in summary then, bit of a global picture there. It's a bit of a rush and there's a lot more detail, which I'm sure you'll come back to elsewhere. We've got some implications from COP26. We are global leader on that. We're the leader until we get to Egypt next year for COP27. So there's plenty of opportunity within that time to increase our NDCs even further, to make our contributions even more telling. And we need to do that in order to get that 1.5 degrees in reach. And we need to do something as well at the local level. And I know that's something you're going to spend a lot more time discussing in the future. So that's it for me. If you've got any more questions, I'll be more than happy to answer those as we go forward in this session. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much to Tim for that presentation. So before we move on, we're just going to take 30 seconds now just to reflect on what Tim has said, and importantly, note down any questions that you may want to ask Tim later on in the Q&A panel. Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker now. So the purpose of the next presentation is to set out the emissions that what we know from Herefordshire, the key emissions that are in Herefordshire. And we're going to hear from Ben Boswell, who's Head of Environment, Climate Emergency and Waste with Herefordshire Council. So can we start that presentation now, Max? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ben Boswell and I'm the Head of Environment, Climate Emergency and Waste at Herefordshire Council. And this morning I'm going to be giving you a short presentation on carbon emissions across Herefordshire. So that's building on what Tim has just taken us through, looking at national and international, and really focusing down on what our carbon footprint looks like in Herefordshire. So this morning, what I'm going to take you through is really giving you a short overview of the different ways we can measure our carbon footprint and the pros and cons of each. Taking you through how we've currently and how we've historically done our carbon footprint, looking at what's our footprint made up of, what progress have we made to date, and then sort of looking at some benchmarking of how we compare to others and what our footprint looks like compared to theirs. Moving on from that, I was going to touch on a new and improved carbon footprinting method that we've just been looking at, doing a lot of work with the Midlands Energy Hub and BASE, the government department, which is really looking at a more holistic data set that includes more. And then, as well as that, looking at a new method, which is looking at our consumption-based emissions, which is a slightly different way of looking at it. Then what I was just going to touch on then is a few key considerations and opportunities to try and help get you thinking about different ways you can reduce emissions. And then very lastly, just really to give you a flavour of the Herefordshire Council's carbon footprint and the progress we've made. So just touching on the different type of emissions, historically, we've always looked at what we call territorial emissions, which is very much looking at the emissions that come from consumption in an area. So the pros of this really are, it's a very standardized method. This is something that's been around since 2005. All local authorities have been using this approach. And the good thing about that then, it enables us to do benchmarking, to do long-term trends. The problem is it's only relating to energy, so it doesn't include other greenhouse gases like methane. So it's a very, very good, robust data set with a lot of historic data, but we want broader than that. And really that's the new one I'll come on to, which is very much including greenhouse gases and methane in particular, with Herefordshire being an agricultural county, it's such an important part of the puzzle. Problem is though, it doesn't have that historic data. So what we'll be doing is looking at both going forward. And then the third one, as I said, is really around consumption. So instead of looking at what's generated through actually using fuels in an area, it's looking at what's the carbon of what we use, what we purchase, what we eat. And okay, it's slightly different, but it really gives you a better insight into how our behaviours as individuals affects our carbon footprint. So just starting with what we call the territorial emissions, which is very much what is emitted in Herefordshire through our consumption. And as you can see from this one, it's predominantly split into transport, domestic and industry, with transport being the biggest in this area. What's interesting as well is you can see the public sector emissions, which is about 2%. So for example, the council is probably about 1% of the total. And so that's why it's so important that everybody plays their part. this one, the data set is collated by government. It takes them about 2 years to put it together because it's just so many different data sets looking at fuel consumption, mileage, all sorts really, and it all comes together and is published nationally. As I said, this I can touch on historic data in a second. And the other thing to consider is it includes a factor for what we call share of national assets. So what the government didn't want to do is unfairly disadvantage anyone that might have an airport or more motorways through, because they consider them as national assets. So what they've done is they've taken that and split it out per population. So within our emissions there'll be a small percentage for things like power stations and motorways. So how are we doing? What's our performance to date? So as you'll be able to see on there, there's two colour lines. The blue one is backdated because we first started to set our targets off the Climate Change Act. But what you can see in red is actually the actual data from Herefordshire. And pleasingly, there's been good progress to date with it coming down. But I think what I've tried to show on this graph using the green dotted line is what our current trajectory looks like. So if we keep going as we're going, we're projecting to get to carbon zero in Herefordshire by 2044. Now, whilst that is quicker than the national target, it's not quick enough for what we've commit to and what we as Herefordshire want to achieve. And so what I've tried to do is to show in that little wedge of cheese at the bottom, that's the size of the challenge, is getting from our current trajectory down to the Herefordshire 2030 challenge. And I mentioned the national target as 2050 because that is actually going to be a bit of a challenge for us, because we want to go faster and we want to be more ambitious. And so what we need to do is we need to really go above and beyond to get there. So just touching on others, I won't go into this one into too much detail, but what I wanted to show was really how our footprint compares to others. And so really the main things to take from this is Herefordshire as a land base, as a very agricultural county, actually has quite a lot of carbon sequestration. And you can see at the bottom there, there's kind of a negative effect of about 9%, which is carbon coming out of the atmosphere and going into trees and other plant life in Herefordshire. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same split as in the other graphs. And it gives you a rough feel that we have slightly higher on industry and commerce in Herefordshire, but otherwise we're fairly reflective of England and other neighbouring authorities. What is interesting is if we compare ourselves to other local authorities and looking at performance, there's a general trend line where we're all coming down at roughly the same rate. But pleasingly, if you look at Herefordshire, we were slightly higher than some of our nearest neighbours and the national average. And whilst we're following the same trajectory, we are starting to accelerate our reductions slightly faster than others. So you'll see that we've kind of gone from the top of the pack to the middle of the pack, which shows some good progress over recent years. So that's territorial emissions and how we used to do it with just carbon. What we've been doing a lot of work on recently is saying, well, actually, we need to incorporate wider greenhouse gases. Agriculture is such an important part of our makeup that we need to reflect that. And so this is a brand new data set that's only just become available. We're doing a lot of work with it at the moment. And as you can see, what we've been able to include in here is agriculture, and predominantly looking in particular at livestock and the crop related emissions. And as you can see, that's 26%. So our carbon footprint here is obviously bigger, but it's better, it's more reflective and includes all the emissions in the county. Again, what we can't see in here is the negative effect of, the positive effect of taking out carbon through offsetting. And within that, we're doing quite a lot of work, and we're looking at it being between 71,000 tonnes of carbon to around 216,000 based on the newest data sets. We're still calculating that at the moment. And again, this is just another way of showing it. And what I wanted to show here was the kind of below the line bit from agriculture and land use. So the other way we've started looking at carbon emissions is around consumption. So it's looking at, rather than what's produced, what do we buy, what do we use? And what's interesting is this is actually quite a bit smaller. So we were looking at 2,000 kilotons of territorial emissions, where it's around 1,500 from our consumption. So really what that is showing is that actually we consume less carbon than we create because we're a net exporter of goods. In particular, you look at the agricultural sector where we're exporting across the country and elsewhere, a lot of food and drink, high quality food and drink, and that's a really key part of our economy. So I just wanted to touch on that. But what this is really helpful for is to help people understand how their behaviours and their consumption affects them on a more personal level, because this is a bit more reflective of a personal carbon footprint. So in terms of key considerations and things for us to consider, like I said, Herefordshire is an exporter of high quality food and drink, and that's something that we're very good at, and it's an opportunity for us to do that more sustainably. We're going through a huge change in farming and how legislation and land management schemes are being funded, so that's a really good opportunity for farmers. It's important to recognise that as a rural county, we've got a big reliance on the car use. Our building stock is predominantly older and more interesting and more historic, but with that comes some challenges, because we've got 30% of our houses which is pre-1919 and about the same which is off the gas grid. So they just require some more innovative retrofit solutions. In terms of opportunities, the retrofit challenge could bring with it a huge economic activity of businesses diversing into retrofit, into new carbon solutions. In Herefordshire, we've been a national leader in anaerobic digestion, and we've got very high levels of solar in the county. And again, trying to meet that challenge of transport, we're looking forward at electrification and how we switch to low carbon vehicles is going to be a really good opportunity for Herefordshire. And in that, we've got an awful lot of best practice. You're going to hear a lot more about that throughout the assembly. And so just one final slide, really, I just wanted to share with you, that's how the county is doing. And this is really how Herefordshire Council is doing. So at the same time as declaring the climate emergency and setting a zero carbon for the county, we set a zero carbon for the council by 2030. And I just wanted to sort of show you that, you know, we're very much on track to be delivering that. And you can see within this, we've had our 2 carbon management plans. We're currently into our 3rd. We'll be writing our 4th shortly. And, you know, we're very much hoping to accelerate and deliver zero before 2030. So I hope that helps to give you a good overview of carbon emissions in Herefordshire, and hopefully that helps you to go forward for the rest of the session. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ben. I hope you've all found that really useful in terms of giving a Herefordshire context to what we're talking about. So as before, we're now going to just take 30 seconds, again, to give you time to reflect on that, note down any key questions you have for Ben. So we'll start that now. Okay, we'll move on now to the final presentation we're going to hear this morning, which is a slightly different topic. So we've now heard our facts about climate change and what the emissions are. So we're now going to think about why it's so difficult to tackle. And we have with us Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, who's the director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, CAST, from the University of Bath. So we'll listen to Lorraine's presentation now.
Hello, my name's Lorraine Whitmarsh. I'm a Professor of Environmental Psychology at the University of Bath, and I am very happy to be joining you to talk about acting on climate change. So I've got a few slides which I will show you now. Okay. What I'd like to cover in this talk are 3 main points. First of all, I want to talk about why it's difficult to take action on climate change, how some of these difficulties might be overcome, and who has the power to make change happen. So we've known about climate change for a number of years, but we haven't yet made much progress in tackling it. And that's because it is difficult to act on climate change for a number of reasons. I'm going to talk about 2 of these big reasons. The first one is the way our economy and politics work. Our economy has been dependent on fossil fuels, that's coal, oil and gas, for decades, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So the way our factories are powered, the way we heat our homes, the way we travel, most of those things rely on coal, oil and gas. And while we're starting to shift away from that to more renewable sources, we still are quite dependent on fossil fuels to do the things that we need to do and for the energy that we need. Similarly, a lot of the way in which businesses work is that they make money out of getting us to buy more stuff, more physical things, and those things take energy to produce as well. And so a lot of advertising and marketing is encouraging us to buy more, and we're not really encouraged to keep things for longer, to reuse things. But all of this consumption, this buying more stuff, that also produces emissions. And at the moment, there's not really any cost to individuals or to companies to pollute the atmosphere. So we're not penalised if we drive a petrol car, for example, or if we heat our home with gas. We're not paying extra for the pollution that we're causing. And similarly, businesses are not penalised for that. So that's really the economy. And similarly, politics. Well, climate change is a global problem, and all of the countries in the world have signed up to the Paris Agreement. That's a big UN treaty to tackle climate change. So they've agreed we need to take action, but countries are not so far doing as much as they should to tackle climate change. Part of this then is because at the national level, it isn't always a priority. And in the UK, arguably, we should probably be doing more than a lot of other countries because we've been polluting for a longer time and we are a wealthier country. So we have more that we could invest in tackling climate change. But we have other priorities as well. And similarly, electoral cycles tend to be short term. So governments are only in power for up to 5 years at the most. And so they tend to focus on things that are more short-term issues, things that they can tackle successfully in the course of the time that they're in power. So climate change often is not necessarily a politically an issue that's prioritised politically. But at the same time, it's also about psychological barriers or behavioural barriers to tackling climate change. Humans evolved to focus on things more in the here and now. So it can be difficult for us to really think about sort of global long-term issues like climate change when, well, we often have other things to worry about, you know, going to work, feeding our kids, etc. And similarly, climate change is something we can't directly see ourselves. It's something that we've learnt about through scientific measurement, looking at trends over time in global temperatures, for example. And we hear about that through the media, through the newspapers, TV. And so we might interpret it differently, and you know, to what extent it's a human-caused problem or that it's a serious issue. People differ in their views because it's not something that we sort of directly can evaluate ourselves. And so we do debate the issue and there's room for interpretation. Also, as a global problem, individuals might feel there's nothing that they can do about it. And so they sort of think, well, I don't see anybody else doing much. So is there anything that I even as an individual can do? Maybe you feel like sort of a drop in the ocean. And if we don't see anybody else acting, it sort of feels like maybe it's not a normal thing to do. We know we are influenced by what other people do. And if it doesn't seem like a normal thing, we may not think that it's something that we should do. Habits can be a big barrier to doing things differently. So it might just, we often do the things that we just do in the same way every day, and we don't necessarily think about doing things differently. It can be expensive to go green. An electric car, for example, costs a lot more than a petrol car. It can be inconvenient or difficult as well. And so if there isn't a bus service where you live, or there aren't cycle lanes where you live, it can be difficult to move away from car use, for example. Or sometimes we just don't know what is the best thing to do, which is the best product to choose, which is the greener product that has the lower carbon impact. So knowledge can be a gap. So that's a lot of barriers, a lot of difficulties that we can face, but they can be overcome. We know that changing society, and that is what we need to do to tackle climate change, needs action by all of these three groups that you see here on the slide. By government, so that includes the UK government, but also local government, so Herefordshire Council, for example. By businesses, so businesses can change what they do, they can make things in greener ways, they can change the availability and prices of products and services, and individuals and communities, you and I. And that's really a key part of this, actually, because what we know from scientific evidence is that nearly 2/3 of the measures that we need to reach our climate change targets will involve behaviour change, changing the things that we buy, the things that we do, how we travel, how we eat, how we heat our homes, etc. So there's a big role that you and I and communities can play. And these arrows between these groups that you see here are important because we can exert influence on others in this social system. And I want to give you one example here of travel. So if we look over here on the right, we can see that there are lots of things that we as individuals or communities could do if we want to reduce the emissions from travel. We could buy an electric car if we can afford it, or we could switch from driving to taking the bus or walking, for example. We could also, though, write letters to our local councillor, or we could take part in a protest or sign a petition to call for better bus services where we live, or better cycle paths, for example. So we can exert influence on government to make it easier to change our behaviour. Similarly, we are consumers. So when we buy an electric car, for example, we send a signal to businesses to say there is a market here for green products. And so they might start investing in those sorts of things more. And you can see the sorts of things that businesses can do over here. They can provide electric vehicles, or they can provide bike hire services, or they can improve bus services, or whatever it is that they do. They can do things as well to support their staff in changing their behaviour. So they could encourage people to work from home if they can, or have cycle to work schemes. They could also ask the government for support to make it easier for them to take action. So there's an influence that they can have up to government too. And then government up here, you can see they can do a lot. They can implement economic measures like congestion charges, or they can provide subsidies to make electric vehicles cheaper. They could invest in building bicycle lanes or improving buses and trains, for example, so it's more convenient and attractive to take sustainable travel choices. They can invest in virtual technologies as well, so that maybe we don't even need to travel quite as much. We could have more online meetings as well. So there's lots of things that government can do. And that's summarised here on this slide. So on the left, you see all of the sorts of things that governments can do to help businesses, communities and individuals reduce emissions. They can provide information and advice, so they can put labels on products, for example. They can invest in solutions, so they can spend more on low carbon options. They can tax high carbon options as well, so they become less attractive. And they can change laws and provide regulations, maybe even banning the most polluting options. On the right here, you see the sorts of things businesses can do. They can change what they do and make, and how they make them, so that they are lower carbon, for example. But they can also influence consumer behaviour. They could put labels on products, and they can try and influence government to change the rules. And what can individuals and communities do? As I mentioned, we have to change our behaviour in a number of ways to reduce our carbon footprint, and these are the most effective things that we can do to cut our carbon. So we can give up our car, we can alternatively buy an electric car, we can reduce our flights, we can get renewable electricity, take public transport, and so on. But beyond reducing our own emissions, we can also try and change society. We can influence others. We can speak to our friends and family, just try and talk to people about what are you doing to reduce your carbon footprint. Make that sort of action more normal. We can influence others through social media, writing to our councillors or MPs, taking part in a protest or a petition, acting at work, joining a community group, and so on. So altogether then, I've talked about why it's difficult to take action on climate change, partly because of how our economy relies on fossil fuels and people buying more stuff, and partly because our politicians find it difficult to deal with global long-term problems, and because as individuals and communities we also struggle for lots of reasons. We don't want to think about it, it costs more, it's inconvenient, and so on. We can overcome these difficulties though by governments, businesses and individuals acting together to change society. And we as individuals do have power not only to reduce our own carbon footprint, but also to try and change the system, to try and influence others as well. And that's another important way in which we have power. So that's all I wanted to say, and I'm really looking forward to seeing if you have any questions as well from that. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lorraine, for that presentation. So we'll take our 30 seconds now. Please remember to note down any key questions that you'll be able to ask Lorraine after the break. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move you back into your small groups, and facilitators will explain to you what you need to do when you get there, but we're thinking about the questions which we're going to ask facilitators after the break. So can we move everybody now, Max, please? Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had a useful discussion in your groups and come up with some good questions for our speakers who will be joining us after a break. So we're going to go into a 10-minute break now. So we're going to reconvene at, sorry, I've forgotten the time, which is really bad, 11:38. So 10 minutes. You don't need to log off or anything like that. You can just turn your screens off and your cameras off. Keep yourself on mute, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Our question and answer panel. So we're joined by our three excellent speakers. We have Tim Yer from Midlands Energy Hub, we have Lorraine Whitmarsh from the University of Bath, and we have Ben Boswell from Herefordshire Council. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to go to each of your group facilitators, and they're going to put forward your top question from your group. We've got 30 minutes for this session, which is quite generous. So then once we've asked your top question, we'll go back round and ask your second question. So can we start with Lauren, please? And just to say about the mute, if you can remember to keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. But yeah, if we could go to you, Lauren, for your group's first question, please.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, everyone. Lots of layers, but the question is, what is the council's current plan regarding electric car use as a solution, recognising that many of us live rurally and the poor transport links, and importantly, the high costs and any negative impacts of electric cars, such as the cost, the battery disposal, and what the grid can cope with? I think perhaps, Ben, that's something that you might be able to answer for my group.
Thank you, Lauren. Oh, gosh, I thought Max had done that, sorry.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, brilliant. So I suppose a couple of questions in there. So the council's been doing quite a lot of work on electric vehicles for a while, to be honest. And we've got two major pieces of work going on at the moment. So the first is we're working closely with Energy Saving Trusts to develop a new electric vehicle charging strategy, looking at electric vehicles holistically. So really saying, up until now, we've put some points in across the county to try and get a network going. And we've been trying to put through planning policy, the condition for more to go into new developments. But really what we've tried to look at is, okay, where are we now? Where do we need to get to? How do we get there? And really what are the future needs of Herefordshire likely to be? So we've been doing a lot of work with them on a kind of holistic strategy looking forward. So that's work in development at the moment. So we have to share more on that in the near future. And at the same time, we're also out to tender at the moment for a partner to work with us to massively increase the number of electric charge points across the county. Doing that sort of in partnership with a private organisation. To then we've done a lot of mapping of where we think charge points need to go across the county to sort of meet needs, and what public infrastructure we've got that we can offer to a partner to say, well, you can invest there, and then we can really accelerate the infrastructure. So hopefully that addresses the one part of the question. The other one, I suppose, is around really is it on cost of charge points and or the cars in particular. I mean, the costs of the cars are coming down significantly. I mean, a couple of years ago, we did a big fleet review, and we invested in quite a high number of electric vehicles for the council. And when we looked at that, I think it was around 8,000 miles per year, and it broke even as being, well, it turned out to be cheaper than running a traditional vehicle. So I appreciate they can be more expensive to buy new, but the second-hand marketplace is starting to filter with more of them in there now, so that cost will come down. But for us, we invested in, you know, our fleet of pool vehicles and service vehicles for hybrids and electrics, and we did that on a cost and carbon basis. So it's really trying to help us to achieve our carbon footprint reductions, but also, you know, it's saving money as well. So it's trying to look at it not just at the cost of buying the vehicle, but it's the running costs as well, and they're significantly lower. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Ben. And also, just to let everybody know, we are discussing transport in a lot more detail tomorrow morning. Lorraine, I didn't know whether you wanted to say anything in relation to behaviour change and that, you know, modal shift from to electric vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that cost is definitely one of the barriers. At the moment, there are some government subsidies to reduce that initial cost. Leasing is another popular option, incidentally, that a lot of people are going for. So you just pay a monthly amount to have an electric car, and then the running costs, as Ben has just said, are much, much lower as well than petrol vehicles. So there are ways of getting them, but at the moment, yes, the infrastructure is starting to develop, the costs are starting to come down. So those barriers are beginning to be removed, but it is a process. And yeah, so I think that is one of the things that's starting to change, but I see Ben wants to come back in.
Okay, thank you, Lorraine. It's funny how some people can do it and others can't.
Brilliant, yeah, and just to build on that, one thing I forgot to mention, actually, we've got a project live at the moment where we're working with a number of communities across the county to set up new car clubs, and as part of that, we're funding electric vehicles as part of that, so that people can then join a car club in a locality and have access to an electric car in that way, as well as a different way of, you know, well, it's a better potential way to use cars, but also to give people the opportunity to use them. So I can share some more info on that separately if that would help.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Ben. I think we'll move to the second group's question now. So we were going to go to Paul's group next. Paul, do you have your priority question from your group, please?
Yeah, this is also a question for Ben. As part of your presentation, you showed a graph which indicated the reduction so far in Herefordshire, what we've already done. Could you say a little bit more about what caused that reduction, so we can maybe harvest what's already working, and if there's time is offsetting a con?
So I suppose in terms of how it's come down, it's a huge variety of actions across all the sectors, really. So lots of work on sustainable active transport modes, lots of building retrofit. So it's really, I suppose, it's really trying to look at each of the sections in turn. And I've kind of done a short overview for each of the sessions later. But really, if you look at buildings, it's around trying to get more energy efficiency measures in, which is very key. So we've been running a lot of grant schemes and support. There's been national schemes as well. So with insulation, looking at lighting, the council themselves, we've invested heavily in a large number. So I suppose one project that we did a few years back was looking at all the public lighting in the county. So we changed all of the street lights to LED, and that gave us a sort of 75% reduction in energy consumption there. So it's a lot of projects like that. Also, I suppose, with businesses. Businesses have had a big push as energy prices have gone up to try and reduce that and save money. So we've run a lot of schemes, and it's not just about what the council's running. This is, you know, lots of businesses, organisations, individuals taking action as well. And on top of that, to be honest, I think what showed in one of Tim's graphs is, you know, the electricity, the intensity of carbon in electricity is coming down nationally as well, and so that is having an effect on all of the consumption across the county as well. So it's around the behaviours we as individuals have, how we're using resources better, investing in reducing our demand, and then nationally it's that implication of energy intensity of carbon coming down as well. So I don't know if that helps. You mentioned on offsetting as a con. I think offsetting's got a, you know, it's got a place within the overall strategy, and I think what we're approaching, we've targeted net zero in Herefordshire, and our approach there is to sort of look at our balance of how we can have our I suppose it's going to be some emissions from some things we do, and it's then trying to have an offsetting or a sequestering that carbon to then balance it, so we have a net impact on the atmosphere. And our approach is very much adopting a hierarchy that's very much around, you know, reducing the need to use the consumption, then using it more, you know, getting that as efficient as possible, then looking at sustainable sources of energy, and then if we can't do anything and we do have some residual emissions, is then how do we offset that? So I do think it has a place, but for us it's that hierarchy in a similar way that we address waste. It's around, you know, reduce, reuse, recycle in that kind of order.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I don't know whether you wanted to say anything more about offsetting specifically, just in terms of what we mean when we talk about offsetting. And Tim, you may want to contribute to this as well. But if you could give a kind of short explanation of offsetting. Oh, sorry. I could do with this in my own house, this facility.
Sorry, I shouldn't mute myself again. So in terms of offsetting, it's around the various different ways of taking, well, either sequestering carbon, which is where carbon is taken out through natural processes, or even industrial processes, where carbon is taken out of the atmosphere and how that's recorded. And then in terms of offsetting, it would then be investing in projects that do that elsewhere. So if you're not able to do that yourself, you might invest in another project locally, or even the purchasing of energy that is zero carbon. So for example, the council, we buy all of our electricity from renewable energy backed sources, so we can go back and say this is coming specifically from renewable energy as its origin. So really that's the general sort of term for it. I don't know if Tim wants to jump in.
I think you've summed it up pretty well there. I mean, there are numerous different ways of offsetting. I think we have to be very aware of ensuring we don't greenwash some of the offsets. I mean, that's something which is often thrown out as one of the criticisms, but we have to make sure that we are very transparent when we say something is being offset. We just need to be clear about how we're offsetting it, and make sure that we have got all of the certificates that come with green electricity, for instance, all lined up, so we know exactly where and how it has been offset. We can't then therefore be criticised for using that. I do see offsetting as the last resort. We should be trying to do as much as we can to reduce our emissions, first of all, through a number of different energy efficiency or efficiency schemes, and then offsetting really is our last resort if we can't do it by any other means. We will need some elements of offsetting or sequestration, but yeah, we need to be better with our use of energy first.
That's great, thank you, Tim. Okay, we'll move on to Vicky's group.
Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, yes, sorry, your mic, we're getting a bit of feedback off your mic, a bit echoey. Okay, we'll move on to Vicky's group. Vicky, did you have your kind of priority question?
Yes, my question, our question is for Tim, and is 1.5% only achievable if all countries are involved, and by extension, I suppose, in the UK, all counties involved. I've added that bit, I have to say, sorry group, but it's yeah, that's the question.
Yes, is the answer. It's not something that one country or one county can actually do anything about on their own. It's got to be something which is a global effort to tackle. According to the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, 1.5 is still possible, but only if everybody does their bit. There's no other way we'll be able to achieve it.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. Okay, Kath, can we come to your priority question next, please?
Yes, sorry, I've had to pick that based on the answers we've had for previous questions. So
okay, great.
I hope I'm representing my group sufficiently. There was a question about the national and regional categories on the statistics that made it quite difficult to compare. So can we compare our progress in Herefordshire with other similar rural counties so we can compare like with like? And in addition to that, can you clarify what research is available for assessing behaviour change?
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Kath. We'll start with comparisons first and go to you, Ben, if that's okay. Oh, Ben, sorry, you seem to be on. We can't hear you.
Yeah,
yeah.
Tim may want to jump in as well, to be honest, because we've done quite a lot of work together on all the data sets. So in terms of, when I went through my presentation, I went through 3 different data sets. So the one, which is the one we've been using for an awfully long time, is, yeah, we can get data sets for all of the local authority areas in the country, and we can look at that, so we can compare, you know, by types of local authorities and nearest neighbours. I think I picked a few of our local ones. I think I picked, was it Shropshire and Worcestershire, just to give an example. But I could do a graph that shows how we sit across all sort of shire counties or sort of unitary counties. Also, we could look at, I suppose, others. We might look at Cornwall, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and others that are quite similar. So I could do something like that if that would be helpful. We also look at it in terms of per capita emissions as well, noting that not everyone has the same level of population. So there is data available in those data sets to say, how do we look at what's our carbon emission per person? And at the moment for Herefordshire, I think it's 5.2 tonnes per person is the split of our total emissions by population. So that, again, that's another way of comparing it. So yeah, if it would be helpful, I could do a one-pager to circulate.
Yes, please. I think that would be very helpful, and then we can either email that out to people. Well, we'll do both. We'll email it out and put it on Basecamp. Thank you, Ben. Tim, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before we move on to Lorraine? Oh, sorry. You and I did it at the same time, Max.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite important to compare progress against yourself, but also against comparable types of local authorities. There's no point really comparing ourselves to Birmingham, but comparing ourselves to Lincolnshire without a similar sort of demographic is sometimes quite a useful thing to do. We should never use those as a be-all and end-all. No, we are quite, Herefordshire is Herefordshire, and we should really see how we are progressing against ourselves. Everybody has a role to play, but I think it's important to see how we are progressing against ourselves, which is why Herefordshire has used the same sort of data set for nearly 20 years, I guess, because it does show comparability over time. And I think that's quite an important thing to do. It's why we tend to keep the same data set, so we don't start changing the data that we're showing and comparing different footprints. That's got inherent errors which can occur. So we just need to be careful about the data that we do compare and make sure that we are comparing like for like. But it is sometimes useful to see where we are compared to Shropshire. But a league table as such is not necessarily the best way to go about it, I think.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Tim. Kath, can I just come back to you about the second part of your question on behaviour change, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. It was about what research is available for assessing behaviour change, because we've looked at the statistics for sort of, you know, outcome and monitoring it, but that's about overall statistics. So this was about assessing actual behaviour change. What research is available for people to see on that?
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Kath.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a large evidence base on, first of all, how much of the measures needed to get to net zero will involve behaviour change. So, for example, the UK Committee on Climate Change has estimated that it's something like about 60% or so of the measures needed to reach our carbon targets will involve some degree of behaviour change. So there's that sort of evidence that comes from models and things where they figure out, you know, all of the sorts of things that are needed and what slice of that is behavioural. Then there's another set of evidence which looks at what works to actually change behaviour and, you know, the extent to which, for example, giving people information, putting labels on products, information campaigns versus incentives and taxes and subsidies and all sorts of things versus regulations and other sorts of measures work to change behaviour. And for example, they show that usually informational type approaches are about 2 to 3% effective. And the more you move up through sort of economic measures through to sort of regulatory and tougher things, the more you get bigger shifts in behaviour. But broadly speaking, the more of these measures that you combine, the bigger effect on behaviour change. So there's a huge sort of academic and policy actually literature that shows, you know, how these things work, and they use all sorts of indicators from surveys that ask people before and after, what are you doing, which is not the best type of measure because everybody likes to say they're quite green, through to much more sort of objective measures really of behaviour that where you might be weighing the amount of waste people produce before and after an intervention, or looking at their energy meters, or counting the numbers of cars on the road, or, you know, depending on specific behaviours that you're looking at. So there's a whole range of different measures that you might use to evaluate them, but they're all sort of captured in these different reports and papers. If needs be, I can kind of send through 1 or 2 links to example papers if that's helpful.
Yes, please. That would be great. Thank you, Lorraine. Okay, John, I'm aware you've got your hand up, but I want to go to our last group just so that we've given all groups equal chance to put their question forward. Thank you for using the raise hand function, by the way. That's great. And we'll come to you after we've covered the question from the last group. So, Mary, do you have your priority question, please? Have we got Mary? No, is there somebody from Mary's group here that would like to ask the question? Is Mary on mute, Max? Yeah, are you able to unmute? Because I can't see her on my screen.
Yeah, Mary is there. She's just muted.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought I was lost in the ether there.
So did I for a minute.
Okay. This question is related to behaviour change and Lorraine specifically. It's about how do we make it affordable for individuals to make behavioural changes, and what sort of incentives would assist with this?
Great, thank you, Mary.
So what are the incentives, and I'm so sorry, what was the second half?
So it's basically how do we make it affordable for individuals to make those lifestyle changes that are required, and what sort of incentives would assist with this?
Okay, brilliant. We touched on one example already in terms of electric vehicles, and so the government has a couple of incentives there to reduce the initial cost of the vehicle, and then you get there's another little economic incentive, a reduction in how much you pay to get a charger fitted in your home, for example. So those are examples of subsidies for encouraging people to get electric vehicles. Similarly, they're going to do the same, I think, for heat pumps to reduce the cost of that technology. So those are the sorts of economic measures that are starting to come through to reduce the cost of those technologies. And at the moment, those technologies are still a little bit more expensive than or sometimes a lot more expensive than the higher carbon alternatives. But what happens over time is that the more those technologies develop, the more people will buy them, the cost comes down as well. So you don't necessarily need to keep those subsidies in place for forever. Just it's only until the cost of those things come down. So, but those are examples of a couple of the things that are happening at the moment. public transport is subsidised to different extents in different areas. So, already buses, for example, and maybe trains in some places are cheaper than they would be without those subsidies. So there's lots of those sorts of things that help to reduce the cost of lower carbon options for people. And I think we need more of those, because still quite often that the high carbon alternative is still sometimes more cheaper. So we do need more of that. Yeah. Did that answer the question fully?
Yes, we had covered electric vehicles quite a lot in our group, and that was the example that came up. I was wondering, are there any other examples that aren't necessarily sort of big capital investments, so normal sort of day-to-day behavioural change?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, using sort of I mentioned public transport. I guess one of the other examples might be the sort of cycle to work scheme as well. So some employers offer, I think how it works is, hopefully maybe colleagues in the council know more about this, but I think employers allow you to have tax-free bikes or something, and then you pay it back through your salary. Is that right? And so there's other things like that. And I'm struggling for other examples. Ben's got lots, I'm sure.
Okay,
yeah.
Well, thank you, Lorraine. Can we come to you, Ben? Sorry.
Yeah, do you want to jump in? I mean, a couple of others that come to mind. You mentioned cycle to work scheme. That's a key one. That's one we introduced, and we've had brilliant success in getting loads of people cycling with that. You mentioned public transport. At the moment, Herefordshire offers free public transport in the weekends. Again, that's another one. And another local example, again, transport, is the Barrel Bike scheme, which has been a tremendous success that was introduced, and that's got a small level of subsidy to keep the costs down as well. So those are sort of some day-to-day ones. Another one, sort of looking at, I suppose it's capital. Renewable energy was a big one. If you look at the feed-in tariffs and solar panels, for example, they started out about £16,000 to install a solar system on a house. That's now down to about 4, and that's through the intervention that came in through feed-in tariffs and grants. And then, as you say, that very much changes the marketplace. Lots more people bought it, lots more businesses diversified. The cost of producing, installing came down, and so it's now a quarter of the cost that it used to be, and there's a lot more mainstream. So I suppose that's just another couple of examples to add in.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Ben. So I'm just conscious of time, but we've got about 6 minutes left for this session. I'd like to open up questions now to the floor. So you'll notice John raised a hand, and so then he comes directly up to my top left-hand corner of my screen, so I can see that he wants to ask a question. So please do use that raise hand function. John, you've put your hand down. Has your question been covered? Oh, sorry, John, you're on mute, and I'm not sure you can unmute until I've allowed you to. Oh, you can apparently, I think. John, we still can't hear you, so I'll come back to you in a minute if that's okay. PJ, did you have a question? Oh, you're on.
Hi. Hello.
Great, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was the host that needed to unmute me. Yeah, I was trying to.
Yeah.
But anyway, so the question is, Lorraine did mention that there's a scheme where you can lease electric vehicles rather than having to buy them if you can't afford it. Obviously, that's not going to be an option because they are quite high in price. So just wondering, is Herefordshire running a scheme like this where we can lease electric vehicles?
Thank you, PJ. Ben, do you could you answer that, please?
I think there's two parts to that. I think one of them is going to be through private lease schemes that offer them as leases, which is what I think Lorraine was referring to. But then there is that other example I mentioned where we are working with car clubs to set up local schemes that people can join and have shared access to vehicles, and through that we are putting some match funding in to help them get electric vehicles for exactly that. So you can have sort of community access to electric vehicles. So again, I can share some information on that. It's kind of work in progress at the moment, but I can tell you where they're evolving.
Okay.
Thank you, Ben. Is that okay, PJ? I just want to go over to John, because I think, John, you're off mute now and you were waiting very patiently for a long time.
So I had difficulty unmuting when you asked me to.
Don't worry.
Two quick questions. One is to Tim and Ben. They've been doing these comparisons on trends between similar councils. Have they found any other area or county that's doing something we're not, that is effective? And the second question was for Lorraine, which was, I think it was in Ben's presentation, he put up a list of legislation the current government has put through in about the last 12 months. And I just wondered, as her being a professor and an external thing, it surprised me how much there was. Is any of it going to be any good and have a likely positive impact? Or is it just camouflaged by the government?
Thank you, John. We've just got a couple of minutes left, but Tim, if I could come to you for the first part of the question, then we'll go to Lorraine. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples across the UK. Herefordshire is not alone in this. Some good examples are around the Cotswolds areas, where I think Rachel has actually spoken to you on Thursday. She's done a lot of work around that sort of part of the country. Cornwall as well, another very rural county, they've done a lot of work down there. So we're not absolute pioneers in this. I'd actually say Herefordshire and the Marches region in general is actually not doing too badly, but we can still learn from other areas. That I can certainly put you in touch with other councils across England.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Tim.
I think Ben's got a follow-up to that.
Okay, Ben, very quickly, because I'd like to just take the second
Yeah, sorry,
part
it was
of
only
the
if there
question.
was time. Just to say, we do quite a lot of work with other local authorities looking at best practice and benchmarking. And I'm really pleased to say there was a benchmarking exercise took place at the end of last year. The results were announced on Thursday and Herefordshire came out top in the West Midlands. But what is in that is there's still a lot of areas for us to improve on, and so actually working very closely with all those local authorities at some of the best practice they've got and how we can bring that here.
Okay, thank you. Lorraine, did you need a reminder of the second part of the question? Because I've certainly forgotten it.
No, well, I do. So yes, it's clear. So basically, is the legislation, I think, that Ben referred to, is it any good? I mean, I think I don't remember all the ones that he had on the slide, to be honest, but I imagine if it's the net zero strategy, the Department for Transport's decarbonising transport strategy, and so there have been various kind of bits of legislation, policy and so on coming out in the last sort of few months, and they're definitely making big steps in the right direction. Personally, I think they need to go further, and I think the Committee on Climate Change said something similar in their assessment of the UK's net zero strategy that came out in the autumn, that it's a really big step forward, but they've missed out on a few areas. For example, they haven't really covered aviation adequately. They've not really got very much at all on behaviour change, which is the area that I work in and which is huge. So there are gaps, I would say, but it's not bad. It's just it's not quite as ambitious as it needs to be.
Okay, that's great. And I'm really sorry, everybody, but that is all we have time for the Q&A. So I'm aware Richard, Peter and Richard B, you've got raised hands, and Dom too. And I know, Kit, you had your hand up at one stage too. If you could let your facilitators know your questions, we will ensure that you receive an answer. And as Claire has written in the chat, all unanswered questions will be answered. So we'll send answers to those round via email and on Basecamp. Okay, so if I could just thank our three speakers, Tim, Lorraine and Ben. Thank you very much for excellent presentations and for taking part in this Q&A. Very, very good. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to Claire now, who's going to introduce the next session.
Okay, thanks for that. We're now going to put you back into your small breakout rooms with your facilitators, and we're going to give you about half an hour just to try and digest, reflect, discuss and come up with some kind of what are the key messages that you've taken from everything we've heard so far. So that take your mind back to Thursday evening as well, and obviously the presentations that you've heard today as well. So facilitators will take you through an exercise and we'll see you in about half an hour. Hi everybody and welcome back. So very shortly we're going to be allowing you time off for good behaviour. So we're going to be giving you an hour off for your lunch. But before we do that, we just wanted to share with you a short video by somebody called George the Poet, which we think sums up what we're trying to achieve through the Assembly.
I apologise, it is advert which I shall try and skip.
A paradigm shift is a change in common sense. But how do you go about rearranging common sense? Especially with years of research and journalism making the conversation long and dense. Well, sense isn't something to try and enforce. It should be kind of endorsed by a reliable source. And in the case of climate change, a good place to start would be science, of course. Now, you remember science from school, an essential subject. Well, let's consider it standing in the general public. Our scientists are in a position to advise us on some of our biggest decisions. And it's probably in our interest to listen, but also to invite others to witness the vision. The first way to do that is to be the vision. Through your lifestyle choices, you can lead the mission. Bring the future to your present when it seems a bit distant. The cleanest existence is green and efficient. And you haven't really played your part until your lifestyle reflects a change of heart. It's a continuous process. I'm still working on it myself, but technology plays a major part. I'm trying to play my part as an artist, but all I do is write verses and harmonize melodies. Now, the point of us working together on this is that one of you knows how to decarbonize energy. So if you could consider that when making your plans, I'm happy to leave it in your capable hands. This is the solution government can't offer: ground level collaboration. Doesn't it sound better than having patience? Instead of sleepwalking into the governance trap, using our imagination to take initiative as a nation, which involves looking at our economic ambitions to ensure that, as well as earning ourselves more and banking ourselves more, we're actually doing things we're thanking ourselves for in the long run. Because a lucrative plan is a smart one, but a sustainable plan is a strong one.
Okay, so we're going to be taking an hour off for lunch now. Just before we go, I just want to say thank you so much to all our speakers that have joined us this morning. We will be back promptly at 1:45 to start again. If you can join us from 1:40, that will be great, just so we're ready to get going. When you come back, you'll notice you've been put back in the waiting room, but you don't need to do anything. We will just readmit you, but your screen might just look a bit differently. That's all. So enjoy some lunch. If you can grab 5 minutes of fresh air. It's a beautifully sunny day here in Shropshire. I hope it is in Herefordshire. Grab some lunch and we look forward to seeing you back at 1:45. Thank you.